In this project I'm going to make a storage box in the style of a traditional Japanese toolbox. In fact, because I want to have the boxes in contrasting wood, I'm going to make two simultaneously. I have two 1200mm boards, one in beech and one in sapelli, and they're both 19mm thick. I'm resawing them slightly off centre so that when I take the saw kerf into account, which is about 3mm, I end up with, for each piece of wood, a board of 10mm and another of around 6mm. So here are the boards. There's a beech 10mm, a sapelli 10mm, a beech 6mm and a sapelli 6mm. There are quite a few tool marks left over from the table saw when resawing. A table saw is not ideal for resawing wood, but I didn't have a bandsaw available to me at the time. I use a number 5.5 jack plane to get down to thickness, and then a number 4 smoothing plane to smooth the timber when I'm more or less there. I use a card scraper to remove any final tool marks and get the surface nice and smooth. I'm just checking with a pair of winding sticks to make sure there's no twist in the board, and then I use one of the winding sticks along the length of the board to check for any bows or high spots, which I'll mark and then I can remove with a plane. I'm spending a lot of time making sure I've got everything completely flat, and then I want everything nice and smooth. It's a lot of work to get everything flat and smooth, but because I'm using two types of wood in each box, I want to ensure that they're both of uniform thickness. I could think of investing in a thickness planer, but I like working with hand tools. And besides, I'd still have to remove the tool marks with hand tools anyway. So that's my boards all ready. I'm now marking up to cut the boards to the lengths I'll need. From each 10mm board I'm going to need two side pieces of 300mm, two end pieces of 200mm, and then the final 200mm I'll cut down for the wedges and fixings for the top. I'm chiseling out against the knife wall here to give me a recess for cross cutting. Now here's everything cut to length. I have four 300mm boards in the 6mm stock, and then in the 10mm stock I've got two 300mm boards and three 200mm boards. I'll just do a rough assembly here to give you an idea of how each box goes together. You see with the beech one we have beech bottoms, sapelli ends, beech sides, beech top, and then sapelli fixings. I use a plane to make sure that the edges of the 6mm boards are completely straight and flat, as I'm going to be joining these together. I join the boards together to make the bottom and the lid, and I'm just going to edge join these with glue. There will be extra structure in the finished box which will help give strength to this joint. I have to be careful when gluing these up that I don't introduce any kind of bowing. While those are gluing up, I can get on with the rest of the box. Now, to follow the style, I want to have an overhang on the length of the box, so I'm just marking the width of the end piece so I get the correct overhang, and then I use the end piece again to mark the width. I'm marking out now where the end pieces will run against the side pieces. I'm using a knife to mark up for accuracy. Also, I'm going to be chopping mortises here with the chisel, and the knife marks help to get the edges of the mortise nice and crisp. I'm going to transfer the marks from my first board onto the second rather than measuring independently. That way I know that they'll match. Having transferred the marks, I now make the full knife marks using the square, and I make sure that I always reference the same edge. With the sides marked, it's onto the ends. The first thing I'm doing is marking a depth for the protrusion of the tenons. I use a marking gauge to do this to make sure they're uniform across both boards. I then use the side board against that initial mark to mark out its thickness. I transfer this to a gauge and mark both boards. I'm using a mortise gauge now. I've set the 2 pins to be the width I want the tenon, and the stop to be the width from the edge of the board I want the tenon to start. I'll then transfer those marks to both sides of both boards. This will make sure that the tenons, when they protrude, are nice and regular. Then, using the square and knife, I'm going to deepen all those markings so I can use these as a guide for the saw. And the same process now on the other end. I use a pencil to mark down the cut just to help guide the saw by eye. I don't need a knife cut here because it doesn't help with the rip cut on the saw. Next I make the rip cuts for the tenons using a dovetail saw. I'm cutting on the outside of the knife line, that way when I come to fit the mortise and tenons together they should be on the tight side and I can slim up the tenons with a chisel to help them fit. Flip the board and do the other side. With the rip cuts done, I can now cut the shoulders. I'm keeping these little offcuts as I'll use them later to create the features for the top of the box. Invariably my saw cuts aren't quite as straight as I would like, so I put both boards together so that they're uniform and just tidy them up with a chisel. And now I have two end pieces that match pretty well. Next I mark up for removing the material between the tenons. I'm using the square here to carry on the square of the shoulders straight across. That way when the joint butts together there won't be any gaps. I put the mark on both sides as I'm going to work from both sides with the chisel. And I'm just making sure that the saw cut goes all the way down to that line. I start chiselling away from the line because the bevel of the chisel will force the chisel backwards into the wood. I now slice in with the chisel to remove some of the material. With the material moved, there's now a lot more room for the bevel, and so I can start chiselling directly on the line without fear of it moving the chisel backwards. I'll flip the board and come in from the other side. Again, chiseling in front of the line until I've removed some material, and then moving the chisel back onto the line. I repeat the process of chiseling down along the line and then removing material. Once we're through, I tidy up the face with a chisel. I offer up the end piece to the sideboard. I can now use the actual cut tenons to mark the position of the mortises. Again, using a square and knife, I'm going to mark out those mortises so I can get them nice and crisp. I've also labelled up the corners so I don't get confused when fitting the box together. It's about this time I realised that I didn't actually have a 10mm chisel. This would be a lot easier if I could have gone straight across, but I'm actually using I think a 7mm chisel here, so I've got to move side to side. By the time I did the companion box, I'd made sure I got a 10mm chisel. So I've got the mortises cut, so I'm going to try the tenons in for the first time. I'm now going to repeat the process and mark up the mortises on the other side. Marking with the knife again. And chopping out the mortises with a chisel. In much the same way as when I was removing material from between the tenons, I'll work from both sides of the board. That way I can get a nice crisp cut on both sides rather than breaking through from one side and risking tearing out some of the fibres. If everything's marked up correctly, the lines should match face to face. Let's try those together. I'll go light tap with the hammer. I don't want to force anything at this stage. It looks like it's a little bit tight, so I don't want to force it and risk tearing out some fibres. I should have got a little bit of bruising on the sides though, which will show me where I need to make the mortises wider. That looks like it's a nice tight fit now. I'm just rubbing off my pencil lines. With all the mortises and tenons cut, I'm just doing a dry assembly to make sure everything fits nicely. I can now make sure everything's seated nicely and square, and if necessary make some small adjustments. I'll remove the clamps from the boards as they're all set up now. And I'm going to need my clamps for the next bit. So it's time to glue up the box. Make sure there's glue on all the mating surfaces. And now I'll add some clamps. I keep checking for square while I'm clamping up. I can make some small adjustments. Though if the joints are right, they should pull things pretty square. Final check for square before I leave it all to set and dry. I'm just using a card scraper on the wider boards now. So this is the next day, this is all glued up. And there we go, there's the initial box frame. Just do a little bit of sanding to remove any bits of glue that have come out whilst clamped up. Just a couple of passes with the plane just to make sure that all the sides and the ends are at the same height. And now I can glue on the bottom of the box. And clamp everything together. Even though everything's pretty square, I'll use quite a few clamps just to make sure it gets a good contact all the way around. And that gets left to dry for another 24 hours or so. The good thing about doing two of these projects simultaneously is that you can be working on the woodworking for one box while the other one is gluing up. Starting to look like a box. Just use a plane to take the bottom down to the right width and make it flush with the sides of the box. I need to take extra care not to smack into the protruding tenons with the plane and take chunks out of them, as they're going to be features of the box. Just use a card scraper to get some final smoothing. So next I just want to mark up the centre of the box so that when I come to fit the lid I can keep the seam down the centre, and I'll trim from both sides. I'll mark up the overhang on that one side first, and I'll cut it off on the table saw. And now I'll mark up the overhang on the other side. Again, I'll remove that excess on the table saw. I don't have any footage of that, I'm afraid. So the lid's nearly down to size now. I've cut it slightly wide on purpose so that I can plane it to final size and get a nice smooth edge. It's a question of testing and then trimming a little bit off at a time until we get it to the right size. There we go, that just fits inside the side with a bit of slop, so that's about ideal. Now I want to put the top caps on the box. I'm just checking the width for the top caps there. It should be 30mm, a 10mm overhang, the 10mm board, and then 10mm overhang into the box as well. That way the mortises are bang in the middle of that top rail. I've cut those to width and now I'll glue them on. I'll clamp them up. And I'll leave these overnight. Now these top rails should be quite strong with just the glue, but we're going to be reinforcing them later. Next I'm going to mark up the lid so I can cut it to length. I'll do that by putting it all the way under the recess and then marking where the back rail is. I've cut that off and you can see it's wide enough that it doesn't fall through, it can bridge the gap across the rails. Now I'm going to measure up and cut the cross pieces. There's a cross piece for either side that will be connected to the lid. As you can see, I've made one of the cross pieces wider than the other. It's 2.8mm wider, and that's to allow for the saw kerf on the table saw, as I'm going to cut this piece down to form the wedge. Marking the position to fix the first cross piece. This piece needs to be completely square to the edge of the lid. Initially I'm gluing these cross pieces onto the top of the lid, but as per the rails on the top of the box, I'm going to be reinforcing them later. Just removing any squeeze out. And again, I left that to dry overnight. So even with just that one piece on, you can see how the lid will start to fit. I'm checking the position for the other rail there. So I've marked up on that cross piece where I'm going to cut it to form the wedge. I'm going to cut it on the table saw, and I'm going to do this by creating a temporary crosscut sled. I'm just going to tape the piece to a piece of old MDF. The line there is the line that the saw will travel down. I align this line with the line I've drawn on the cross piece. That's going to allow me to cut that at an angle. I'm just adding some extra tape there to make it even more secure when I come to cut it. I want the wedge to be angled in two directions, so I'm going to tilt over the table saw. I've set it to 25 degrees, but that's arbitrary really. I could have cut this wedge by hand. In fact, I did on my prototype, but I knew I could guarantee the accuracy of the angle in two directions using the table saw. The reason the wedge is cut with an angle in two directions is to stop it falling out, so the secondary angle helps force it down towards the lid. I'm going to use a piece of off-cut sapelli just as a guide whilst gluing up the cross piece. I'll tape this to the lid and then I've got something to line the cross piece up against. I don't want to get too much glue involved here, as I don't want it squeezing out and compromising the angle for the wedge, and also I don't want it sticking to my guide piece. With that in position, I'll clamp it up and leave it for the night. And here we go, that all lines up and the wedge works perfectly. Now the cross pieces on the lid overhang a little bit, so I'm going to mark those up so that I can cut them off flush with the side of the box. I'm not going to transfer the mark onto the wedge, as I'll leave that overhanging the box for ease of operation. I'm just chiseling into the knife mark to help guide the saw. I'm just trimming up and neatening the edges with a chisel and then some sandpaper. Now these exposed mortises on the side of the box are a design feature, so I'm going to shape them with a chisel. I'm just giving the box a once over with sandpaper after the initial assembly. So the securing mechanism for the lid relies on the mechanics of the wedge forcing the lid against the cross rails. Now all these components are just glued at the moment, and although this may be fine, I think I feel happier if there was something reinforcing the glue joint, as it's going to be under constant strain. So I decided to reinforce this by screwing through into the cross member from the underside of the lid. I'm using a centre punch to mark the position of the screws so everything's nice and neat. Although this is the underside of the lid, it's still a piece that people will see. I'll use my hand drill for this stage of the job, just because I feel I've got a little bit more control and I can be a bit more gentle. And I'll use a countersink bit to make sure the screws fit snugly. The screws I'm using here are 4 by 12 millimeters. With the cross pieces secured to the lid, it's time to do something about the end pieces. And this is where I'm going to use those offcuts that I saved from earlier. I'm going to replicate the look of the exposed tenons on the side and make some caps to hide some screws. I'm using a junior hacksaw to cut these just because I was looking for something with a narrow kerf. I'm marking up where the holes are going to go and matching them with the plugs. This way I can fit each plug so we can have a nice tight fit. I'm marking the rough positions with a pencil, and then I'll use a square and knife to mark out the actual holes I'm going to cut with the chisel. Once again, this job would have been easier if I'd had a 10mm chisel. It seems that all the jobs I've normally done have been using my 12mm or 8mm so far. At least I had recently sharpened all my chisels, so that wasn't a worry. With all the holes cut, I'm now going to drill ready for the screws. Again, I'm using the hand drill. I'll then countersink those holes. This means the screw won't get in the way while I'm trying to fit the plugs. These screws are 4mm again, but this time they're 20mm long. With all the screws in place, I can now glue in the plugs. Custom fitting each of the plugs mean they all fit nice and tightly into the hole. After the glue's all dried and the plugs are nice and secure, I use a chisel to replicate the design of the exposed tenons on the side of the box. And that's the build pretty much complete. All that remains now is to finish the box, so I'm going to do this by starting with a covering of Danish oil. For the first layer I just wipe this on. I put a generous amount on, but I wipe off any excess so I don't get any drips. This is one of my favourite stages of the build as the colours of the wood start coming through. I'll leave the first layer to dry for a day or so and then sand it back. This is with 240 grit sandpaper. I only give it a light sanding. It's just to get it smooth. Once it's all sanded, I'll go ahead and wipe on another coat. After leaving it for another day or so, I'll give it another light sanding, this time with 1000 grit. This last coat of Danish oil I apply with a very fine steel wool. After a couple of days I'll give it a buffing with some beeswax. And there we go, the finished box. And here it is with its companion that I built at the same time. So just to see the box in operation. The lid slides in, pulls back, and the wedge, which is angled in two directions, locks it in and the wedge stays in. And likewise with the companion box with the wood in the opposite orientation. I'm very pleased how these boxes turned out. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel for more projects.